Okay, when you think of really cutting-edge farming, what pops into your head? Probably things like vertical farms, maybe those big gleaming greenhouses, or, crops floating on water. But what if I told you that the idea of growing plants without soil, well, it's actually thousands of years old. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the significance and the really surprising evolution of soilless culture in agriculture.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. We can actually trace this whole concept from really ancient practices right up to modern science and understand why it's not just some, niche thing anymore. It's becoming critical for our global future. We're drawing our insights today from an expert text focused on the significance of soilless culture in agriculture. It gives us a great historical and scientific base.
So let's jump way back because here's where it gets really interesting. Long before modern hydroponics, we're talking ancient Egyptians, almost 4,000 years ago.
That's right. They're all wall paintings found in the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, documented back in 1913.
And these paintings show what? Plants in pots?
Essentially, yes. It looks like the first documented evidence of container-grown plants. And they weren't just decorative. They used this method to transfer mature trees from other places to the king's palace.
Wow, moving whole trees.
Yeah, and growing them where the local soil just wasn't suitable. The source even suggests the growing medium might have been lighter than regular soil, which makes sense if they had to carry them long distances.
So what does that tell us? That early on, humans were already problem-solving around soil limitations.
Exactly. If you look at the bigger picture, it shows this long history of trying to adapt, overcoming environmental limits when conditions weren't ideal for growing things. It was driven by necessity, really.
Okay, that makes sense. Necessity driving innovation. So let's fast forward quite a bit to 17th century Europe. We see something else emerge, orangeries.
Ah, yes, orangeries. These were basically sheltered places, often quite fancy greenhouses.
Right, for growing things like orange trees in colder climates.
Precisely. Places where they wouldn't normally survive. It was partly for aesthetics, showing off wealth, but also getting rare fruits and vegetables.
And our source sees these as another step in container growing.
It does. An early form of container systems, even though they mostly still used actual soil in the containers back then. There's a beautiful example at Pillnitz Palace near Dresden in Germany. They grew citrus trees in containers, kept them sheltered in winter, and moved them outside for the summer.
So looking at ancient Egypt and 17th century Europe, it feels like this wasn't just a random invention, but more of a recurring solution, right?
That's the key takeaway, I think. Soilless culture, or at least container growing, wasn't a single aha moment. It was this persistent response to challenges. Whether it was poor native soil or the wrong climate, people found ways to grow things outside their natural setting.
And eventually, that practical need led to some major scientific breakthroughs, moving beyond just trial and error.
Exactly. Two really big steps propelled container production forward scientifically. First was finally understanding what plants actually need nutritionally.
Okay, the nutrients.
Right. French and German scientists started figuring this out in the 19th century. Then American and English scientists really refined it in the first half of the 20th. Although, interestingly, there was still some skepticism. Even in 1946, some British scientists argued that soil-grown plants yielded more than plants in, say, silica sand with nutrient solutions.
So when did that change? When did the science really prove the potential?
The big breakthrough was in the 1970s. Researchers developed complete nutrient solutions. They figured out how to optimize everything, the nutrients, the water, and the oxygen levels. And that's when studies like Cooper's in 75 and Verwer's in 76 clearly showed that soilless media could actually produce superior yields.
Wow, superior. Okay, so that was step one, understanding nutrients. What was the second major step?
The second one was realizing you could effectively eliminate disease organisms in container production.
Ah, the disease factor. Much harder to control in open fields, I imagine.
Virtually impossible in soil, especially with intensive cultivation. But in containers, it was feasible. A really key development came from the U.S., the UC system for producing healthy container-grown plants.
Yeah.
Baker published this manual in 1957.
UC system, what did that involve?
It was all about using clean soil, clean stock plants, and strict sanitation. Revolutionary for nurseries back in the 50s and 60s. It introduced these UC mixes, specific combinations of things like sand, peat, bark, or sawdust. And using the system gave growers a, quote, dramatic economic advantage.
Right, so it moved way beyond just grabbing some potting soil and hoping for the best.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point in our source material. Modern practice emphasizes very specific physical and chemical characteristics for the growing media. We've moved away from just loosely calling mixes soil or compost. The text is careful to define soil very strictly as the sand, silt, clay, organic matter you find in the ground. For everything else, it uses growing medium or substrate.
Okay, terminology matters, so the science is advancing. But what were the practical day-to-day implications for growers? What challenges popped up?
Well, what's interesting here is the interplay between the plant science and the money side. Horticulture tells you what the plant ideally needs, but finance often dictates the actual mix a grower uses.
Because of costs.
Exactly. Things like how readily available are the materials? What do they cost to process, to transport? Even production costs using that substrate, marketing considerations, and a big one often overlooked.
Disposal.
Disposal, like getting rid of the used substrate.
Yes. For instance, mineral wool, like stone wool or glass wool, is widely used, but disposing of it is a real environmental and economic headache. Recycling efforts are needed, and that adds cost. Plus, you have fluctuations in raw material prices, peat versus coconut coir, for example. That forces growers to constantly rethink their formulas, even the ones they swear by.
So despite those challenges, where is soilless production most dominant today? Where do we really see it taking hold? It's huge in greenhouse production. Think flowers, vegetables. A lot of that is soilless now. Also, outdoor container nurseries rely heavily on it. And pretty much any plant you see in a container in, say, urban landscaping, that's likely grown in a substrate.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. The word hydroponics, it gets used a lot, sometimes maybe loosely. What does it actually mean in this context?
That's a good point. Many people use hydroponics as a catch-all for any soilless growing. But strictly speaking, the term coined by Gagricky back in 1937 refers to growing plants only in nutrient solutions, with no solid substrate at all.
So just water and nutrients.
Basically, yes. Systems like NFT, the nutrient film technique, where a thin stream flows over bare roots, or DFT, deep flow technique. Aerohydroponics, too, which mists the roots. Now, the definition sometimes extends to include systems using completely inert substrates, things like stone wool or gravel, that don't provide nutrients or affect the chemistry.
Interesting. So it wasn't just invented for, big commercial farms then?
No, not initially. For quite a while, scientists used hydroponics mainly as a tool for research.
Research? Into what?
Into plant nutrition, how roots function, that sort of thing. It was a way to precisely control the root environment. Its commercial potential really took off later thanks to advances in other areas like plastics manufacturing for the equipment, automation, better fertilizers that dissolve completely, and just the development of all these different types of substrates we've been talking about.
Okay, so if we connect this back to the bigger picture, you mentioned this ongoing shift towards soilless cultivation, especially in protected systems like greenhouses. What are the main drivers behind that shift? Why move away from traditional soil?
The primary reason, especially in those intensive greenhouse settings, was the buildup of soil-borne diseases and pests.
Right, pathogens in the soil.
Exactly. When you grow the same crops repeatedly in the same soil, pathogens proliferate. It becomes a huge problem. Substrates like stone wool, polyurethane, perlite, scoria, they start out virtually sterile because of how they're made. And importantly, they can often be disinfested and reused. That's a massive advantage for disease control.
Okay, disease control is huge. But are there other performance benefits for the plants themselves in these systems?
Oh, absolutely. Superior control is key. Think about the physical properties. Most substrates, unlike many soils, allow you to optimize both water and oxygen availability to the roots at the same time.
How so?
Well, the structure often means plants don't have to work as hard to pull water out, and oxygen diffuses easily through the pores, preventing roots from becoming oxygen-starved, which can happen in waterlogged soil. Plus, you have much finer control over nutrient delivery compared to the complexities of soil chemistry.
So when you look at all these advantages, what really stands out to you? It feels like it's more than just growing faster. It's about creating this ideal environment, maybe even being better for the environment overall.
You've nailed it. There are significant environmental pluses. Soilless systems can minimize or even eliminate runoff of fertilizers and pesticides into waterways. That helps conserve fresh water.
Which also means better efficiency, right? Using less water and nutrients.
Precisely. Higher water use efficiency, higher nutrient use efficiency. That translates directly into economic benefits for the grower. In fact, we're seeing regulations emerging in developed countries that actually mandate recirculating systems in nurseries and greenhouses to cut down on that runoff.
That's really interesting. But it can't be all perfect, can it? I imagine keeping plants in containers. What about the roots having limited space? Is that a challenge?
You're right, that is a key consideration. Restricted root volume is inherent in container culture. It can lead to limitations in nutrient uptake just because there's less volume to explore and potentially more competition between roots in a dense space. It definitely needs careful management.
Okay, so a factor to manage. But weighing that against the benefits, especially thinking globally, what does all this mean for massive challenges like, say, food security?
It offers potentially huge solutions, especially in less developed regions. Think about areas with poor soil quality or limited arable land. Simple, even low-cost soilless systems could be a game changer.
Because you don't need fertile land to start with.
Exactly. And you can produce a lot of food in a relatively small area. This could be vital for feeding growing populations. It also pushes professionals to innovate, to find alternatives to maybe super expensive, high-tech imported systems, develop things that are more durable and appropriate for remote areas or specific local conditions.
And that brings us to water, which you mentioned earlier. Water scarcity is just such a massive global problem, particularly in developing nations. How does soilless farming specifically help there?
Well, first, as we said, the water use efficiency is generally much higher, especially if you use recirculating systems where the nutrient solution is captured and reused. You just produce more crop per drop of water.
More crop per drop. I like that.
It's crucial in arid and semi-arid regions.
Hmm.
But there's another interesting aspect: salinity. Plants grown in soilless systems often cope better with higher salt levels in the water compared to soil-grown plants.
Really? Why is that?
It seems related to that better oxygen supply to the roots we talked about. Healthy, well-oxygenated roots are better able to manage salts, like actively excluding toxic ions such as sodium, or just tolerating the higher osmotic pressure of salty water.
So you could potentially use water sources that might be too salty for traditional agriculture.
To some extent, yes. And it's not just theoretical. Large-scale soilless cultivation is already happening in very dry places. Think parts of Australia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, southern Israel, places where water is scarce, but they've made soilless systems work effectively. And notably, hunger isn't the primary issue in those specific developed areas using this tech.
It really sounds like, despite this long history, we're maybe still just scratching the surface of what's possible here.
I think that's fair to say. The science of growing plants this way is, relatively speaking, still young. Even with all the progress, there are still many unanswered questions. Lots of room for future research to better utilize the substrates we have and to develop entirely new practices and technologies.
Well, you've certainly taken us on quite the journey today. From ancient Egyptian container gardens all the way to potential solutions for modern global food security. Who knew growing plants without soil had such a long, complex, and really impactful history?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And perhaps it raises a bigger question for all of us to consider. How might our deepening understanding of soilless agriculture start to fundamentally reshape what we even mean by fertile land when we think about the future of humanity?
That's a fascinating thought, something to ponder as you go about your day. Maybe even keep an eye out for soilless growing happening in your own community.